Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I'm happy to be here with you in a new historical era that seems more and more monstrous every hour that goes by. I hope that you're here with me to hopefully, unpack some of the historical perspectives we might benefit from in a time like this, and, to hear conversations with people that have a lot to say about what to do and what we can do, because I think more and more people are thinking along the lines of like, what can we do? I think more people are thinking that now than have been thinking that in a long time. So that seems like an opportunity. And my guest today is someone who has done a lot of thinking about this too. Her name is Kauffman. She is an organizer. She is a historian, activist, and she's written a book that I've been waiting for a long time, and it's coming out this month. I'm very excited about it. It's called Direct Action, Protest, and the Reinvention of American Radicalism. And it's a book that takes the last few decades since the 1960s of left activism and kind of unpacked what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I think it's going to be a book that is going to be really valuable for people that are thinking about how to approach challenging and fighting and confronting and disrupting the plans of this administration. So I had a great conversation with her about both looking backwards and looking forwards, how the left can approach the situation we're in. And I have lots more of these conversations coming for you. A lot more Nostalgia Trap content on the way. You can find more at nostalgiatrap.com, and there's a donate button, PayPal up there. I hope to have a more organized way to give me money soon. But for now, there's a PayPal button you can press up there. I appreciate anything you can send my way. It helps me produce the show and keep it up and running. But there's lots more on the way. So check my Twitter at David L. Parsons. Check the Nostalgia Trap Facebook page. It's all over the place. Just Google Nostalgia Trap. I think you find most of the stuff for the show. So thanks for listening. This is my conversation with activist, organizer, historian, and author Kauffman. Okay, so thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate you sitting down and taking the time. I know you have a book coming out that I'm very excited about, and I want to like make sure that we start by just saying the name of this book so that people can go pick this up, because it's called Direct Action, Protest, and the Reinvention of American Radicalism by Kauffman. Thanks so much for sitting down.
I'm so glad to be here.
This book is touching on something that's come up on this show a lot, which is kind of what's happened to the left since the 1960s. I guess I just wanted to ask to start is kind of like, what was the impetus behind this project? When did you kind of have this thought of like writing a history of the left in the post-60s era?
Well, believe it or not, this book has been 25 years in the making. And I first began to work on it in 1991, which was a period I had been an activist for about a decade at that point already. So I had experienced the landscape of the left, been involved in a variety of different projects. And already by 91, I had the sense there was something new and different percolating in and around ACT UP.
Yes. And
the project began at that conjuncture, trying to get a sense. At that point, it was what is this new kind of activism? Where does it spring from? How is it different from the classic activism of the 60s? Yeah. What different forms is it taking? Then the project continued for 25 more years, so it shifted over the time, particularly as more history happened. But that's where it really started. And in the book, in the story that I tell, ACT UP is the pivot point. It's really the moment when a new style of organizing kind of crystallizes and marks a pivot in the history.
What is different about ACT UP? Because there was a film called How to Survive a Plague that came out a few years ago that I think brought a lot of attention to ACT UP among young people who had never really known about this before, including myself. I mean, I think I knew what ACT UP was, and I knew that AIDS activism was a big part of 1980s and 90s activism. But what was different about ACT UP? What was new about what they were doing? Because they won. I mean, they were like
that's what's different about them, right?
Effective. That's the first thing.
That is the first and most important thing, right? Is that they won when most of our movements were losing.
Right.
And they won against unbelievable odds. I mean, they won in a way with so many losses. There was, you cannot talk about ACT UP. You can't have been around ACT UP without having felt death constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, as someone who knew people in the organization, was at some of the actions, attended a lot of the meetings. I still remember that the particular feeling when this was, before the advent of protease inhibitors, when an HIV infection pretty much meant certain death. And you'd be sitting in a room with people who were fighting for their lives in the most literal sense possible, who were clearly dying and who were clearly not going to survive the fight.
It's like war and activism happening at the same time.
Yeah. So and it's hard to recapture now the extent to which people with HIV were incredible pariahs at that moment in the mid 80s, and the amount of official demonization and within and so including there was ACT UP, the traditional left really stayed away from ACT UP when ACT UP started. It was a coalition of at first mostly white gay men, many of them HIV positive, not all of them. And mostly white lesbians with a lot of organizing experience who came together to work at ACT UP. And you didn't have the traditional left organizations involved in any meaningful sense at the start. So there was a kind of a fresh start in a way, in terms of some of like the tired old habits of left organizing. ACT UP didn't have rallies where people droned on about what the problem with the government was and what our 17 demands were. They would immediately organize actions to figure out how to move forward the specific demands, and they had a constant focus on concrete winnable fights, whatever they were. Was it going at a business that was discriminating against employees who were HIV positive? Was it challenging a public education campaign? Whatever it was, they were constantly finding concrete fights. You couldn't go to a big ACT UP meeting, an ACT UP in the New York chapter, without there being breakout sessions for multiple actions that were going to take place in the next week.
So it's focused on specific issues and direct action, which is the name of your book. And I mean, how are you defining direct action? Like when you say that, what do you mean by direct action?
Well, I'm kind of not defining it because part of what happens over the course of the period that I'm looking at is people are constantly contesting the definition. Right. I mean, that's part of what happens in these movements that define themselves as organized around direct action and then often have really large internal differences about what that means. So, in some very large sense, it stands in contrast to any of the traditional forms of civic participation, like voting. But it doesn't always. One campaign I write about in this book is a lesbian Avenger campaign around an anti-gay ballot initiative in Idaho. They were doing, just door-to-door canvassing in support of a voter initiative. You might not call that direct action at all. And yet in context here was a group of organizers who came out of a direct action organizing tradition. And at a time, this was in the mid 90s when a lot of the mainstream lesbian and gay organizations were using incredibly timid messaging to contest the religious right, and the Lesbian Avengers ran an out campaign where they'd knock on people's door and say, "Hi, I'm a lesbian, and I want you to not vote on this initiative because I could lose my job if you do." So
That's beautiful.
I kind of define that as direct action, or I'm loose about.
I think I know what you mean, though, and especially when you say kind of like, my first entry into any kind of activism was going to anti-war rallies that were big and had a lot of what you're talking about, like droning on and on. There was very little kind of sense of like, what are we doing here, or what am I supposed to do? And I remember always feeling leaving those events feeling kind of powerless. because it was like, I know that there's this giant set of monstrous problems we're facing, but I'm not sure what any of us can really do as individuals. And it seems like a lot of your work is focused on the fact that there are many things that people can do and have done to kind of take these on piece by piece.
Right. Well, I think the movements that interest me the most are movements that hold a tension between a broad and radical in the sense of going to the root analysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to go back to the ACT UP example, people had a very sophisticated analysis of the interplay between capitalism and the healthcare system, right? So they had that kind of a left critique, but paired it with a kind of daring and pragmatism and willingness to like win and move on. Like, so many times on the left, the minute that there's some victory, you have a whole pylon of people complaining that it's not a full victory, it's a partial victory, or it could be reversed, or that whole kind of sad sack leftism. And what the movements that the movements that appeal to me are the ones that say, like, obviously anything we win is partial and fragmentary and fragile, but let's claim our victories and keep winning more of them. And when you build enough of these small victories, you catalyze change that you're not even going to be part of implementing. I mean, that's what direct action does at its best. Is it, usually, when a direct action campaign is successful, the people who organize that campaign are not in the room where it happens. They're not in the room where the deal is made. That does whatever. That reroutes the Dakota Access Pipeline, or that saves community gardens. A campaign I was involved in. Like, you're not part of that. You've created the push and the momentum, and you've shifted the terms of the political debate. You shifted the political calculus, and
and it's mysterious how it all how it all washes out. It's not kind of a one-to-one in terms of we do something, it's done, and we move on. It's kind of like the way that history moves is sometimes not exactly the way we think it's going to be. And so, like, when we're planting these kind of seeds of direct action, we're kind of like, I don't know, producing a continuity that I think is easy to get lost in the sense of like feeling that sad sack leftism and defeatism is very, very easy to fall into if you don't have a kind of wider view. That's why I like your kind of like historical point of view on this stuff, because right now there's this focus on a presidential electoral politics, and everyone on the left and the liberals feel like we lost to Trump, and that's that. And this kind of like real sense of defeatism, when it's like, this is probably the moment where we need to kind of have a wider view and have a longer view and have a kind of examination of what we can do, even if it's tiny, to kind of move this conversation forward and not feel like everything's lost because Trump won the election.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a hard period. It's going to be hard to win things. It's going to be challenging to pick battles that are winnable,
right? And
it's going to be hard to keep momentum. But when you talk about the experience of feeling powerless at a certain kind of left event, there's so much danger in that now. I write in my, my book, the book went to the printer like 3 days after the election. So I had one chance to read it and make changes after the election.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
See, do I see things differently now? And what was really striking to me was that I didn't. I added 2 sentences to the book, and that was it. Because so much of what I'm writing about, when you're writing about the arc of history, of organizing history that begins in the early 70s and goes to the present day, it's wave after wave of feeling defeated, even though there's advances amid that. And there's, in particular, the long, dreary period of the 80s. And one of the things that I write about in that period, there were a lot of efforts at mass mobilizing and at kind of performing left unity, and at having these multi-issue demonstrations or these multi-issue organizations, these multifaceted mobilizations. And the way I feel about them looking back at them is that what they largely demonstrated was the scale of our powerlessness.
Yeah, right.
Like you bring a whole lot of people together to show that we actually do not have the power to change anything.
Yeah.
And the movements that won things in that period were smaller. They weren't about
like
mass
ACT UP,
mobilizing.
right?
Exactly. It's about if you've got 35 absolutely determined people who are going to go and shut down a particular congressperson's office like over and over again, or whatever your particular line of direct action campaigning is going to be, that actually counts more than 35,000 people standing outside the White House saying, here's our list of 12 demands that we spent 6 months negotiating.
Right. And that's how a lot of people envision, I think, activism, revolutionary moments, is that it would be millions in the streets, right? But it seems like a lot of what you focus on in history is not about millions in the streets, but about kind of more determined, focused, smaller groups of people, right?
Right. Well, the moment with millions in the streets that I write about, and it's something that I was very, very deeply involved in, were the protests against the Iraq War in 2003.
That's right.
So the February 15th, 2003 anti-war protests, that it's the single largest day of protest ever in world history.
Yeah.
I now can't recall what the number estimates are, but there are many, many millions. There were protests, and I believe I, at that point, was on the staff of United for Peace and Justice and working in the office that was coordinating the U.S. part of those protests. It was global. And we also maintained the database of all the actions around the world. And we came up to, we had 792 actions around the world on every continent that were happening simultaneously. And many of them, the ones in major cities, London and Berlin, I mean, were massive.
Yeah.
And it didn't do a damn
That's
thing.
what I was going to ask you. Yeah. Are you as cynical about that stuff?
Yeah. A damn thing.
No, that's how I feel too.
And it was, the
and I was there and it felt important too.
Right.
But
The whiplash of mobilizing more people in the streets than had ever been mobilized in world history.
Yep.
And George Bush was asked about it, and he said, well, deciding based on the size of a protest is like making my policy decisions by focus group. He just brushed it off.
He said basically what Nixon said in the late 60s and early 70s, was just kind of like, I'm not going to be affected whatsoever by any of this, and that's that.
But which wasn't true for Nixon. I mean, what I opened the book with is this, so imagine this was not in the cards at that period, at the time of the Gulf War, because it just wasn't where the morale was at the grassroots level. But just as a thought experiment, if you imagine that if instead of having the style of protests that there were on February 15th, 2003, which were these big mass peaceful outpourings in the street, if people had followed the model of May Day 71, which is how I opened the book, which is an almost completely unknown and just extraordinary direct action against the Vietnam War, that is the largest civil disobedience action in U.S. history, where about 10,000 people tried to shut down Washington, D.C., tried to shut down the federal government through decentralized nonviolent blockades all around the city, and freaked Nixon out so much that he called in the actual military. I mean, he called in the Marines and the regular Army and the National Guard, ordered sweep arrests. 7,000 people were arrested in one day, largest mass arrests in U.S. history. There's so many they had to put them in RFK Stadium. But also, he was so freaked out. It so much brought the specter of revolution to his doorstep. The idea that the country was becoming ungovernable because of this losing war, that there's evidence that it sped up withdrawal from Vietnam, that it did what all those other protests hadn't quite done,
right?
Which was strike such fear and alarm in the hearts of the Nixon administration that they were forced to speed up the timetable for withdrawal. So again, 10,000 is not really that many people, right? Compared to the millions and millions and millions who poured out in 2003. It's a different approach.
It is, yeah.
And I think I think the evidence has shown It may not always be the most effective, but in this period of time, it has been.
The May Day tribe in 1971 is an event that very few Americans know about, and that I only really discovered in the last few years. And it's actually I think your narrative of it in the first chapter of your book is probably the most detailed history of the May Day tribe event. And so thanks for doing that, one, but also why is this? Well, I guess I want to ask, like, who organized the May Day tribe? Where did that come from?
Well, it was at a moment when a lot of people on the white left had there was a whole wave of newly radicalized people after 1970, after the invasion of Cambodia
and Kent State, right?
Kent State.
Yeah.
And you had this whole wave of new kind of militant radical people who hadn't been part of SDS, hadn't been part of the earlier white left organizing. And you still had a few kind of leftovers from those days who had been in and around the experiments with armed struggle and the experiments with bombings and all the kind of
the Weather Underground stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these were people who were
young, I'm assuming.
Well, I mean, Rennie Davis is over. They're probably around 30 at that point.
Oh,
they're
yeah.
in their upper 20s. But so it kind of, it was people who were kind of around the perimeter of the Weather Underground, had seen that didn't really work, had seen that it had appealed to people because nonviolence had come to seem so passive and was associated with being kind of pious and sitting there quietly and praying while you got beaten up or by the cops for doing. So it was this particular Rennie Davis and a small circle of people around him who were interested in updating nonviolence in a kind of post-weather political environment, right? So something that was more aggressive, that was more confrontational, that was mobile. I mean, people had been playing with mobile tactics before in many contexts, but not quite on that scale. That was disruptive, but also was decentralized. So it was led by some kind of classic new left white men, the sort of men who had been dominating and leading movements for the last however, but who were perceptive enough to pick up that there was a change in the atmosphere and that people didn't want top-down leadership. People didn't want centralized organizations anymore. People wanted to organize in small local groups and to have autonomy. So it was kind of like this interesting kind of generational bridging, this moment. Like they were sensing what was to come, but they still were part of the old. Part of what happened with the protests is that the organizing wasn't all that decentralized. In fact, it was kind of a small, unaccountable group.
That's so fascinating about the May Day tribe. Experiment. Yeah, it's like it's kind of this amalgamation of a lot of different streams of thought among activists and radicals in the 60s. The May Day tribe kind of puts a lot of that stuff together. God, it makes me wonder, like, if there had been more events like that, how history changes, and if we need to use that model now, because it's something that is something that more people ought to know about.
Right. Well, I mean,
and
you
how
have to remember
effective
that
it was.
Well, it was effective in retrospect. To everybody who participated in it, it felt like a rout. It felt like a disaster and a rout. The worst organized protest in history. People just got rounded up and arrested. It felt like it was a waste of time. There's an interesting lesson there because we don't always know when we go out,
That's that mystery thing.
Right.
You don't know how your actions will have an impact, right? And it might what feels like a loss might kind of sow the seeds for the victory. Right.
I mean, there's some mobilizations and actions that movements come out of energized. The Seattle WTO protest would be a great example. People came out of that fired up.
People are still talking about the battle in Seattle.
Right, but in feeling like it was a battle that we won and then we went on and we took the fight to new places. People didn't come out of May Day like that. People came out of May Day like fighting with each other, bitter, burned. But having push forward the organizing traditions in these new ways that stuck. That's what I then trace in the book, is that there are all of these things like the use of affinity groups to organize and direct action, and these decentralized coordinating structures, all these things that started there really and carry on to this day.
So, how did you come to activism in your life? Did you come from a family of activists, or is it something that happened later in life for you, or how did you come to?
No, I grew up in a pretty much all-white Republican suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Wow.
The most racially segregated city in the U.S. I had a feminist grandmother who was an important and large influence on me, and began reading feminist texts pretty early when I was, in my early teens.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was 16, this was in 1980, 81, when the new right was ascendant, and the Wisconsin state legislature was considering a bill that would have required parental consent for abortion.
Mm.
And that was what got me organizing. And I joined the local chapter of the National Organization for Women when I was still in high school. And Milwaukee, being the size of city that it didn't have multiple feminist organizations. So kind of everybody was in NOW. So even though NOW in a lot of ways is thought of as, I don't know, a kind of very conventional and mainstream women's organization, at that point in the early 80s, the local chapter that I was introduced to had this fabulous array of women who really opened my mind politically. I mean, there were a lot of socialist feminists, but there were radical feminists, lesbian feminists. I mean, there were kind of all these strains, cultural feminists, and so that was my entry point. And then I never looked back from that. But so my entry point was very much through feminism, but through an activist feminism.
Yeah, and during you say about the ascendant new right. There's a feeling, among a lot of young people, especially now, of this kind of like horror at the coming administration. But I always think to myself that, especially now, that God, what must it had been like to be young and on the left, or even just progressive, when Reagan was elected, and when the 80s kind of took over. It seems like a really dark time. I was a little kid, so I remember Reagan as just like a literal kindly grandfather because I was a little kid. And then I got older, and I came to see Reagan as this monster, and everything that happened during that time as monstrous. It seems like that was the moment that you really became more of an activist.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And was it a lot of the kind of feeling that the country was moving right that pushed you to that?
Yeah, well, it was the specific trigger was an attack on reproductive autonomy,
right.
Right-wing attack on reproductive freedom. But absolutely, that sense, when I think back to, I was quite young, right? So I was a teenager. So when I was absorbing the meaning of the Reagan presidency, I didn't have a depth of historical comparison, right? To know how it felt, but I have to say it didn't feel as alarming as this moment. It didn't feel there wasn't quite the same. There wasn't the same sense that the institutions of a democratic republic were in the process of being dismantled. There was the same sense, the sense of impending calamity we all have around the climate now, especially in light of the likely directions on energy policy and climate science. It's
cartoonish at this point. Yeah.
But in 1980, we all had nightmares that we were going to die in a nuclear war with Russia.
Right. There was an urgency.
The fear of nuclear annihilation, the fear that Ronald Reagan was leading us into doom, loomed very, very large, and is part of what underpins some of what I think was the most interesting political energy in that period, which was a lot of the energy that came out of punk, and which was a way of kind of screaming in the midst of despair, knowing you're powerless and deciding you're gonna be like the mosquito in a tent, right? Right? Like you're small, but you can still cause trouble.
Yeah, right. And the punk movement, I mean, was that something you got into? Is that like, was that your culture? Were you a punk person?
I was kind of the gender politics of punk by and large were not so pleasant. So I was more, I was less drawn to the punk subculture in the 80s than in the 90s when it got queerer and when it got, and sort of when it, the version of it that, in the late 80s found expression in ACT UP and its offshoots, in Queer Nation, in the Lesbian Avengers, in Wham, which was a reproductive rights direct action group that did some great work in that period. That was the punk that appealed to me, as opposed to the mosh pits and the
right. I think a lot about the kind of the intersection of culture and politics, and it made me think about, like, I don't know, when you're thinking about ACT UP, the odds that this group is facing are so complicated, because they're biological odds against this disease, political odds against a system that doesn't give a fuck and isn't going to do anything about it, but also cultural odds in the sense of most Americans have a shitty attitude towards gay people, and I think that's still true, but even more so in the 1980s, right? And I wonder what you think about, like, kind of cultural, kind of the way that American culture has changed since then, and like how that has affected, because it seems like that's part of the battleground, right? Is kind of like getting American culture to shift, or using culture to kind of change people's minds about who gay people are and what role they play in our society. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean,
because it seems like a lot of the victories that gay people won have been kind of cultural victories, if that makes sense, and that they're very visible in the culture. That, I mean, I'm thinking about all the stuff, like mainstream stuff that happened since like the 80s, including like Ellen DeGeneres coming out on TV and that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, all of which then helped pave the way for, say, gay marriage.
Right.
The approval of gay marriage and gays in the military and all, all those kind of major steps and wins. I mean, the movements that I've been the most closely connected to and interested in have certainly, like, for example, Queer Nation would be a great example of this in terms of the relationship between cultural change. I mean, cultural change is a tricky terrain for organizing and activism. And one of the things that happened in Queer Nation, which kind of came out with, like, we're here, we're queer, get used to it.
That's right.
This explosive message. Nobody was saying that when they came out. Nobody was reclaiming queer in that way outside of small subcultures. It wasn't part of a stack of initials that were used everywhere to describe a community.
That's right. Yeah,
it was a transgressive word. It was a transgressive concept. And so Queer Nation as an organizational entity helped get that message out there. But really, when you look at their actions, I mean, the actions were really, like, okay, so you're going to protest outside the Academy Awards. It ended up always being protests about particular representations of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks, or it ended up being just kind of like culture jamming stuff. The Queer Nation stickers, which the cover of my book is an echo of Queer Nation stickers from back in the mid 90s. There's a limit to how much you can sustain a movement around trying to catalyze that kind of change.
Right.
And yet that ends up being some of the, the most important foundational work. So I don't know, I don't.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the lesson for organizing is there, but.
It's mysterious. It's another one of those elements. It's kind of like, well, how do you move this? Because it seems like an ingredient in the mix, right? Is that we have to change people's minds somehow, and we have to kind of like, intervene on the landscape of cultural possibilities and the way people think about these things. But you're right. I mean, how you do that is really, really tricky. And your book seems to be focused more on kind of like, what can we actually get accomplished that's like concrete, right? Like policy seems to be something that you're kind of like focused on more. It's kind of like, how do we shift the practical application of law and stuff like that, right?
Right, but except it's I don't think that actually quite captures it. So
okay.
I would use so an example of a kind of initiative that really interests me would be the forest defense movement in the Earth First forest defense movement in the mid 1990s, when Bill Clinton signed this salvage logging rider that suddenly opened up a whole bunch of old growth forest to logging operations. And Earth First, which had been around for a long time at that point, doing a lot of just like stunts mostly, began these serious campaigns to try to stop the salvage logging rider, but by fighting over specific parcels of forest. So people would set up backwoods blockades that were fighting over the fate of, I don't know, I'll just make this up, 750 acres of old growth forest. A tiny little,
yeah.
I mean, there's hardly any old growth left, so every square inch of it is precious. But, fighting over these tiny little parcels as a way of intervening in this larger policy question.
Right. Okay.
Right. So it's not like, let's go lobby in Washington about logging policy.
Yeah.
It's not even, let's go do a sit-in at our congressperson's office over logging policy. They would set up these blockades, and in the course of setting up these blockades, part of what you see with part of what I think makes these movements radical is that they almost always, as I said earlier, they have a deep analysis, but they often dream of an utterly transformed world. So they would set up these, they called them free states, which is kind of grandiose for a couple dozen dirty anarchists in the woods. They'd set up these little prefigurative model communities in the woods around the blockade. There was a way of kind of enacting a dream of what a sustainable society might look like. At the same time that every time the logging trucks came up the road, they'd be locked down to these elaborate blockades and barricades that they'd made and keep the logging trucks away. So it's that how do you win something real?
Yeah.
While dreaming of the kind of changes that we're never going to win.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a better way of saying it. Yeah.
We need to. We need to hold on to those dreams in order to keep working, and keep organizing. And I also, I find that it's the people with those radical visions and with those radical dreams who end up being the risk takers, the ones who are willing to really put their bodies on the line for this policy change.
Well, it seems like I hope that if there's one thing that comes out of more lives being threatened by the system, you have more people who are then willing to put their bodies on the line. The Standing Rock thing was, I think, an important victory, and it came at just the right moment in some ways, right?
No kidding.
Did you feel like I think we talked about this a little on email, but it feels like the presence of the veterans was something, it's changed a little something. And I don't want to say the veterans were the whole force that changed Standing Rock, obviously. But their presence was important. And it seems like that's a population that's really could be vital when we're talking about direct action in the future.
Yeah, the veteran mobilization around Standing Rock was really powerful. Obviously, Standing Rock, was initiated by young Native folks, started the encampment without looking for permission from their elders or from large organizations, and it grew over time. It tapped into networks that had been built and strengthened over what is now, going back to the early 90s, a lot of indigenous-led organizing around environmental issues and through the Indigenous Environmental Network and a number of other formations. So, there were these kind of like deep long-standing networks that got pulled in. People from the direct action community were there providing support and training. You had this convergence, in this native-led space of many different forces. And then it certainly seemed like the moment when veterans organized in solidarity to come and stand as human shields, that was what put it over the edge. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. And that was folks mobilized through a longstanding group, Veterans for Peace, which has been around for decades. Did important work around police brutality in Ferguson. Did important work around. I mean, every war we've been in since Vietnam has. They've played an important role. So that was very powerful to see. Very powerful to see.
And I mean, it's not over, right? I mean, Standing Rock thing is seems like.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, all victories are temporary. This
right.
Provisional. This one, perhaps especially so, given the priorities of the incoming administration.
So I know this is like a big question, but I did want to talk about kind of the Democratic Party. Do you see the Democratic Party? I mean, I'm a real cynic about the Democratic Party. I mean, but. And I know a lot of people are and aren't, and even the cynical ones are, let's work with them. I mean, do you see the Democratic Party as a real barrier to a lot of the success of these movements?
Yes.
Yes. What's been your experience with that? I mean, I guess we can think maybe in the period of time where you were getting involved in the 80s with the organizations that you got involved with. I mean, what was the tone of the Democratic Party's politics in fighting Reagan? Did they fight Reagan at all, or did we see something like we saw the Democratic Party with kind of like giving in on everything? And because I really think of Bill Clinton as like the guy that like moves the Democratic Party right, but it doesn't.
But the move was already
right?
happening beforehand. I mean, spinelessness from the Democratic Party is an old story, and it's one of the great tragedies of America, and it's going to be one of the great tragedies of the period we're entering. Already, it's absolutely shocking how little we've heard from the Democrats since Election Day. How little outcry there has been against Trump's appointments and against the illegitimacy of his election. The weakness and timidity of the Democratic Party. It's one of the great tragedies of our times.
So how do we overcome that if we're people that want to kind of address that? Do we take on the Democratic Party on its terms? Do we work with them? Do we try to get more radical Democrats, or do we create a new party? And is this kind of like Republican Democrat thing just keeping us from really moving forward at all? And I know that's a big question. I know we don't have answers for that.
Right.
But.
I mean, I guess what I can say to that is I think there are a lot of very solid people thinking in interesting ways about how to take over the Democratic Party from the grassroots right now. And there's more robustness to those efforts than any I've seen in my lifetime. I think it's going to still be a very big uphill climb. That it's a party that is so heavily controlled by corporate interests. And so embedded within a logic of neoliberalism that it's going to be very difficult to take over. But I admire the people who are trying to do that. And that's a lot of people who worked on the Bernie campaign, and others as well. That's a long game. That's not a 2-year plan. That's not a 4-year plan. More power to them if they can do it.
Isn't it frustrating though to see, because the history, right? And reading about activists kind of struggling over what to do about the Democratic Party and should we get more radical candidates next year. I mean, they've been doing this for a long, long, long time. The conversation hasn't really changed, and it's frustrating in a lot of ways to see people still kind of like thinking, well, how do we shape this Democratic Party? And it's like there's been this question for a very, very long time. I mean, the Democratic Party moved away from like real working class politics a long, long time ago.
Yeah, but as I said, I think that the efforts to retake it are more robust, more sophisticated, and possibly better resourced than other attempts in the past.
It does feel like a different moment.
When you think about I lived through the Jesse Jackson campaigns. That was the great hope that people had.
In 88? Is that right?
84 and 88.
Yeah.
And, people had such hope for the Rainbow Coalition. And this was the coming together across lines of race and class and gender that we needed. And this was a new vision of a new majority and a progressive social democratic vision for the country. And outside of Jackson's electoral bids, almost nothing came of that experiment. There were almost no freestanding organizing efforts that came out of it. There were almost no organizational entity. It was a vehicle for his electoral ambitions and not much more. And
you're seeing the Bernie campaign this year as different than that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And
I think I would agree.
It was different all along. It was different. It was different in the way that grassroots organizers interacted with it from the start. You had a lot of people who came out of Occupy in particular, who decided to engage with the campaign but create parallel outside structures from the beginning. There just has been a level of strategic sophistication that we didn't see. I mean, I think that, the grassroots around the Rainbow Coalition, people just hoped that the Rainbow Coalition would have its own life independent of Jackson and would run candidates, kind of be the formation that could then transform the Democratic Party. And that absolutely never happened. Will it happen now? I don't know, but it's off to a better start than that previous effort was.
I think I agree in the sense that, I mean, just my own observations of young people and the students that I've had that were Bernie supporters and had Bernie stickers and buttons on their bags and things like that. They were often the students that were not just about kind of vote for Bernie and that's that. They seemed like they were organizing. They were people that were involved in groups on campus and off campus to do things. And they kind of knew, they had a sense that there was something more than just Bernie. Because I think they know that Bernie is symbolic in some ways. Because it's not going to be him that's going to lead this coalition, whatever happens. He's an older guy, and he's been around for a long time, and we're going to need some fresh blood to lead us and use those principles. But as someone who's been around activism and left circles for a while, can you give me like a little bit of perspective about Bernie Sanders? I mean, was he there as a presence? I feel like...
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bernie's been around forever. I mean, he was first elected mayor in Burlington, if I'm remembering correctly, in 1980. So right around this time that we were talking about earlier, when Reagan takes power, there was the second chapter of my book is called Small Change, and one of the themes of it is how people shifted to the small, shifted to the local, to smaller scale organizing in a lot of different contexts in that period. And what people were calling radical municipalism was one of those paths. And so, Sanders with the Progressive Coalition in Vermont, he was first elected in 1980 as the mayor of Burlington. So it was socialism in one city. But he was always around. He was...
What was your impression of him? Did you feel he was an ally? Because there's a lot of people see Bernie Sanders as like playing this like sheepdog role, right? That he like sucks up the radical energy and kind of puts it into the Democratic Party where it goes to die. And I know that's a cynical view. But Sanders is someone who's been kind of like the lone socialist in Congress for 30 years now.
Yeah, I honor our firebrands and our stalwarts, and he do I see him as some kind of progressive messiah who's going to lead us into, a new era. No, but I admire. But he's put in the work.
It's important. Yeah, he's an important figure. Yeah,
he's an important figure. Who could show receipts. I mean, who was there for decades doing the work.
Yeah,
he didn't just show up to do this presidential bid out of, ego and a desire, for self-aggrandizement. I mean, it really came out of, many decades in the trenches. Now, in the trenches in Vermont, in a largely white context, as an older white guy, I mean, there's ways in which,
you can problematize anything.
But I admire him.
And I think a lot of young people actually, you talk about showing receipts, and a lot of young people saw Sanders, the pictures of Bernie getting arrested during the civil rights movement, and they thought that was pretty badass. And they didn't see the similar things from Hillary. They didn't feel like she could show the receipts in the same way. And it feels like a lot of young people. Bernie's kind of whatever happened to him in the primaries. It sounds like the Democratic Party literally destroyed any chance of him ever getting the nomination. But that turned a lot of young people off. I mean, I feel like a lot of young people were, and not just young people, but people that were real Bernie supporters, kind of. I don't know if they didn't vote for Hillary or if they did, but either way, his he felt like an authentic figure to a lot of people.
Yeah,
and his loss in the primaries, I think, hurt in a lot of ways. But maybe overall, the coalition that he put together is still there. Hopefully, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's like right now, extraordinary to watch him being the only real figure that's loudly contesting Trump from this presidential election, because Hillary disappeared after the election. And Bernie's
the People for Bernie Sanders, which is this social media operation that started independent of the Sanders campaign and then outperformed it. They've been posting screenshots of their analytics page where compares where they're comparing the page performance of Donald Trump's Facebook page and Bernie Sanders' Facebook page and the People for Bernie Sanders' Facebook page. And since November 8th, since the election, the Hillary Clinton campaign has not posted a single thing. It's just flat. It's like these millions of followers they had, this incredible resource, and they're not a peep.
No.
Nothing.
And also very little self-reflection from the campaign or kind of like what they did wrong. Right now we're hearing that it was just Russia hacked the election and that's what happened. But it feels like more of a political loss, too. I mean, it feels like strategically the campaign didn't do what it needed to do to win the election, and in particular didn't create a message that resonated with people. Certainly not in a way that Sanders' message resonated.
Well, obviously not, and obviously the DNC chose the establishment candidate, who was a deeply flawed and unpopular candidate. But I'm just so not interested in those. There's the piece that's been circulating about it was the Russian hacking didn't lose the election.
Cares?
It was Hillary Clinton. I'm actually not interested in looking. I'm not looking. I mean, of course, we need to look at the failures on our side in order to retool and think to the future, but it's a stolen election. It was stolen in slow motion through voter suppression efforts, and it was stolen in real time through FBI and CIA meddling. It's a stolen election. Hillary Clinton has a commanding lead in the popular vote.
3 million, I think, right?
Yeah, I feel like every second that we spend looking in the mirror about what went wrong is a second that we're not challenging the legitimacy of this election.
Yeah, right.
And it's a lost opportunity. And, you can bet if things had turned out the reverse, that the Republicans would be out there fighting tooth and nail, denouncing the legitimacy of Hillary Clinton as president with every breath they take. And, of course goes back to, the theme of the weakness of the Democrats, but it's a weakness of the left as well. Just a lack of of spunk and moxie,
Yeah,
and willingness,
right. Yeah, yeah.
you know, and which is where, you know, the movements that I admire, and, you know, we'll go back to like ACT UP as a prime example, like the most hated pariahs in America,
Yes.
people, you know, when they were first arrested, like the police used to put on gloves to
Yeah,
arrest
yeah,
them.
yeah.
They were, you know, like saying, can I say this on your podcast? Like, fuck
Yeah,
you
yeah.
at the top of their voices.
We say a lot of that on the podcast.
Okay, good. I wasn't
Yes.
sure. I don't know if you have to follow FCC rules with the podcast, but
also
saying, you know, just saying, fuck you.
Yes.
Our lives matter. We're going to shut it down until things change. That kind of determination is what has won.
Yeah.
It's
appealing. I mean, it's weird because it appeals to something American. You know what I mean? And I hate that whole, like, I don't know, American exceptionalism, or but that kind of attitude, and in a lot of ways, that attitude of "fuck you" got Trump elected in some ways. I mean, aside from all the irregularities and the stolen aspects of the election, which I think are absolutely vital to kind of to talk about and confront, because I mean, for me, it was the 2000 election got me started thinking about, because I was young, and when the 2000 election was stolen by the Bush people, that's when I kind of like lost faith in so much in terms of looking to the mainstream system to do anything, because it felt like shadowy forces are under control here. And I was reading like Greg Palast and all that, like Best Democracy Money Can Buy stuff, and that really radicalized me, because it felt like this is like totally outside of our control, at least this part of it. So what is under our control, right? And that's why, you know, when I think about your book, it's like you've written a history that it kind of looks at what people can do, what people have done. It must have driven you crazy during the Obama years, because it's something we talk about a lot on the podcast. Because during the Obama years, it's like we got direct action for the first time in a big way that the mainstream media is following. You have the Tea Party and Occupy and Black Lives Matter, and I think it was in that order that those things emerged, right? What were you thinking as you were because you were in the middle of writing this book, it seems like, about like what was it about the Obama administration or the Obama years that created this outburst of political activity from so many different kinds of Americans?
Well, the classic theory on this is the revolution of rising expectations, right? That when people have more hope that there can be change, and then the change we can believe in,
yes,
and then the change doesn't happen,
right?
People feel empowered and emboldened.
That was a gamble, that slogan, change we can believe in. I mean, it's kind of a calculated, cynical thing, because it like kind of was saying, look, I know you've been fucked with before, and I know you've been lied to before, but this time is different. But it wasn't. Or at least a lot of people saw it that way.
Right. I mean, you know, the three big outbursts that you described, I mean, the wellspring of each is pretty different. And, you know, the specific case of Black Lives Matter, I mean, I think that the juxtaposition of having a black president in the White House while police killings continue unabated and impunity continues unabated, that was a particularly explosive combination. And so many of the young people who led the street protests around police killings around the country, you know, a lot, had voted for the first time for Obama, or had been active in political organizing for the first time in the Obama campaign. I mean, the Obama campaign, particularly the first time around, really activated people and particularly young black folks on a scale that hadn't been seen. So you have this whole layer of folks, a lot of, young millennials of color who, had a level of hope that there might be change in their lifetime, had a taste of political engagement in the sense that engagement mattered, and they had the devastating reality of Mike Brown's body laying in the street for 4 hours and the like, which pushed people over the edge. So
that's right, and it really gets to something that you started this podcast with, this conversation you were talking about, like the idea of like a lesbian going and knocking on someone's door and saying, "Hi, I'm a lesbian," and like the body is there, right? And it's like there's something intimate and something about the idea of Mike Brown's body laying in the street for 4 hours that like mobilizes people because it's outrageous, right? And it's like in your face, and there's something that's not abstract about it. There's something that's not a list of 17 demands that all touch on intersectional economics and all that kind of stuff. It's instead a body on the street, and everyone can kind of touch that. Everyone
Right,
can understand that.
and direct action is bodies in the street. There's a
right.
way in which direct action is itself. It's very much an embodied experience. It's very much about putting your body out in the world in a way that's not expected.
Yeah.
In a way that's breaking the rules, in a way that's taking risks. And, as much as the internet has been important for political mobilization in this era, I think what we learn is that it is bodies in motion. It's bodies together in the street that make change.
Well, that's another development that's happened since you started writing your book, right? Is that the internet has come, right? And that social media begins to be a kind of organizing tool. And it's hard to make judgments about where that's going or where it is, but it seems like that Obama was the first president in the social media era, and at the same time there were these kind of like grassroots organizations that sprung up out of it. Do you see the internet as important here? Because I think it can be a barrier too, right?
Actually, I mean, yes and no. I mean, obviously the internet is important, and anybody who's organizing now is thinking about how to use it and how to use internet tools. But people had mobilizing tools before the internet,
yeah.
And some of those tools, unfortunately, have gotten so rusty that they've hurt our overall organizing performance.
What are the tools? Which tools got rusty?
So for example, so most people who are at all on the left know that it's a myth that Rosa Parks just sat down one day on the bus, right? They know that she went to the Highlander Center and she was an experienced activist and she'd had training in direct action and she'd been thinking about this campaign and thinking about how to intervene. People know that.
Yes.
What people don't know, mostly, is that there was also a network of women's organizations in Birmingham that had been organizing for months and months and months and had created a clandestine distribution network through these women's clubs, such that the day that Rosa Parks was arrested, she's arrested in, was it the morning or the afternoon? I'm not sure. But before the start of the workday the next morning, women organizers, had gotten 60,000 leaflets by hand distributed to black folks all around Birmingham, telling them not to take the bus and to participate in the boycott. That is powerful. That's more powerful than any Facebook said, than any Pantsuit Nation, or
and a lot of people would say, well, what's great now is I could distribute those 60,000 flyers with just one tweet. And it's like, well, right. Yeah, not the same,
as
the
person-to-person engagement. And
yep. I agree.
One thing I'm advocating in this period is starting to work on some, organizing projects moving forward is how we get back to having some of the material culture of activism,
yes.
the leaflets. And
I come from the underground newspaper stuff of the 60s. So this stuff is the material culture of the left.
We need those dead trees. We need leaflets. We need handouts.
Don't you have a collection of those things? I assume you do.
I have a vast collection.
So do I. And it's like, it really is stuff that I really prize. And because it feels like, as much as the internet is absolutely vital for setting up our communications and allowing us to spread information, at the same time there's something that's kind of different than someone actually showing you that they're not just pressing the like button. They're showing up at your house and we're having coffee together and we're going to work on this together. There's something vital about that it brings makes the politics real.
Well, there's also something different about intervening in physical space and in the physical landscape. I mean, I spend a lot of my time in a small town in the Catskills, which is in the far western Catskills and is in overwhelmingly red Trump country. And there's more stories there, but I could.
I'm sure there are.
Well, I mean, I got a taste of it a couple of years ago when I asked the county fair to ban sales of the Confederate flag. That didn't go so well.
Oh,
they
God.
said the more of them, the better.
Jesus Christ.
But we'll bracket that story. But
Yeah.
in the monthly, starting in August, before August, I didn't see a Donald Trump yard sign pretty much anywhere. They started going up. Few just tentative pioneers kind of put them up, and it was like, ooh, you losers are going to put it, like you're going to get your windows smashed. Nope. More people joined them, more and more and more. The day after the grabbing pussy revelations,
right.
I drove through the Trumpiest town,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a little harvest festival, and women were enthusiastically grabbing Trump yard signs to go put up in their yard. More yard signs went up that weekend.
That's incredible because people thought
sense,
that grab him by the pussy comment was like, that's it. That's the end. No American would ever vote for this person.
And if you,
it made people double down on him.
I texted someone I know at the New York Times that day and said that you should come to this town and see what's going on because it's not what you think.
The psychology of that is
people
amazing.
are rallying to Trump today in this town.
Yeah.
And more and more and more signs kept going up until I was there the weekend before the election, and it was a sea of Trump signs through this whole county, Delaware County, and upstate
That's unbelievable.
New York, and not a single Hillary sign anywhere. People were afraid to put them up.
Mm.
She wasn't distributing them; she was charging for them. I mean, you could criticize the campaign, but more to the but it it was a way of that's a staking a claim to legitimacy in the public space when you're putting those signs out there.
Sure.
People don't wear buttons that say their views anymore the way they used to on the left. Those went out of style in like the late 90s.
There's an old guy in Brooklyn that's on the train. I don't know if you've seen him. That he sells them. He has like a big.
Yeah, there's some people here and there, but you don't really see them, right?
One guy.
Yeah. It's not a thing in the way that it used to be, where everybody would have political buttons. We don't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, people maybe still do bumper stickers a little on their car, but
barely bumper stickers.
Barely. There's like, people
used to see like think globally, act locally, and all these kinds of things. You barely see that stuff anymore.
No, people post it on their Facebook wall.
That's right.
Or post it on Twitter, but not out in the public sphere.
It needs to come back.
And since I think the problem is not that our side was small, like we didn't lose because our side was smaller, we lost because our side was weaker. And part of being weaker is not saying who you are and not being out in the public sphere with like a statement of who you are and what you stand for.
That's so well said.
I'd like to see some of those things revived.
Me too. Because I mean, it's just nice. When you see it, it makes you feel like we can win. When you see the visibly on the subway or wherever you are, that there are people on your team that share your values. It's a really key idea, I think. And when you were talking about Rosa Parks just now and the kind of like women that were surrounding in Birmingham during that boycott, it makes me think of, I don't know if you know, I'm sure you do know about like the Flint.
Sorry, I said Birmingham is Montgomery.
Yeah, you're right. Flint. Birmingham's the king, right?
Sorry, the Montgomery bus boycott, of course.
Right. But it makes me think of the Flint sit-down strike in 1936-37, when the men of the factory occupied the factory. There's a documentary. It's on YouTube that I've shown a couple times in my classes called the Women's Emergency Brigade, and it's about the women of that town, women of Flint, Michigan, who surrounded the factory where most of their husbands were inside the factory, and they surrounded the factory and acted as human shields, but also brought food and kind of like supplied the whole thing. And they were kind of the heart of the movement. And the film does a really great job of kind of explaining why and what the terms were, the economic terms were for women in being involved in this movement and helping their husbands and helping the men of the town like overcome this tremendous exploitation that General Motors was putting on them. And it all makes me think about the work that you've done in this book, and it's kind of like following up and kind of continuing and seeing that, people have, despite the fact that we think that the 60s are like the last time there was a big flash of activism, that there's been this period of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the way to the 2000s today of like a continuity of Americans doing direct action to confront this stuff. And
with women very much at the center of it. I'm glad I brought that up about the sit-down strike, because that's another theme in the story, the way that I tell it, is when I look closely at the histories of these movements, what I see is women carrying most of the crucial work, women being absolutely key to the development of the organizing techniques and the organizational building, the movement building work, and in particular the movement bridging work, that when you see lessons being carried from movement to movement and skills being transferred, it's usually women who are doing that. In a lot of ways, the book could have been subtitled "How Women and Queer Folks Reinvented American Radicalism." These are mostly folks who weren't doing it for credit. They're mostly not being spokespeople for the movement. They're mostly not coming out with manifestos or books of theory. Their names are mostly lost to history.
Yeah.
But that's who has been doing the work, and that is finally beginning to be reflected in the framing of the work. I think you see that really powerfully in Black Lives Matter, which from the very beginning is not just that although many of the police killings that have been the focus of the movement were of men, much of the core organizing has been led by women and gender nonconforming folks, and an intersectional feminist politics has been the absolute foundation for all the thinking about strategy and tactics in that movement in a way that makes the concrete nuts and bolts work that the women have been doing to build the movement pervade everything about the movement's character and politics.
Yeah.
It's quite beautiful.
It makes me think of Fannie Lou Hamer, and the kind of like that there is a history of women being the kind of like practical leaders of these movements, and that do get forgotten. And then sometimes we hope that historians discover them and tell everyone else about them. L.A. Kauffman, thank you so much for joining me. I think your book is incredibly important. It's called Direct Action, Protest, and the Reinvention of American Radicalism, and it'll be in bookstores in February. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, L.A. Kauffman. I had a great time talking with her. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. I think her work on the history of the left is stuff that a lot of people need to listen to right now. Her book is called Direct Action, Protest, and the Reinvention of American Radicalism. And I really can't recommend it enough. I think it'll be a valuable guide as we move forward in challenging what's coming. So speaking of that, there are more Nostalgia Trap episodes on the way, and you can find more at nostalgiatrap.com. You should also check my Twitter feed at David L. Parsons. I usually have the latest episode pinned at the top, so you can find more there. Thanks very much. As always, take care. Goodbye.